Hallmark has a tradition of producing those heart-touching commercials. You know, the ones that make moisture come to your eyes and then, no, I'm not crying. No commercials made me cry, you know. And they produce those commercials, especially in the Christmas season. They seem to really amp it up when it comes to touching people's hearts in that season. This year's selection of commercials that they're putting out there don't break that tradition. They're on the theme of caring, and each is a depiction, we're told, of something that has actually occurred in the lives of one of their employees. Of the ones I've seen so far, my favorite of the commercials is the one that shows a young woman. I think she's stepping off a bus at the beginning of the commercial. She has her umbrella over her head. There's a driving rain coming down, and she's smartly dressed. She looks, her hair and her makeup, you know, are in place. She looks like she's going to some office there in the downtown area. And as she walks down the sidewalk, she passes a homeless man. A man's sitting on the sidewalk with his back up against the wall, and the rain's just pouring down on him as he's unprotected. His head's cast down. It looks like he's just determined he's just going to keep sitting there throughout the rain. At first it looks like she doesn't even see the man as she walks right by him, but she only takes a few steps past him when she turns around, comes back to the man, and hands the man her umbrella. She goes on to the building that she was going to, and in the process, she gets soaked. By the time she enters in that building, her hairdo's gone, her makeup's gone, you know, her hair's just hanging down in strands. Her nice clothing there is all clinging to her body. You see her there in the waiting room there in that office building. The secretary comes out and calls her name, and she stands up in her drowned rat appearance and makes her way back to an office door. And it's at that point that you realize that she has shown up at that building that day for a job interview. She's going into a job interview drenched, looking possibly her worst, because she had given her umbrella to a man that she didn't know, a man that she might not ever meet again, a man who could do nothing to advance her. She went into a job interview having perhaps traded her future at that company for that man that she didn't know. And she's going in with a smile on her face. I saw that and I think that writer probably doesn't know it. The person that wrote that commercial probably doesn't know it, but that's probably about the best expression of agape love I've seen acted out there. You remember agape love. Agape is one of the names for love in the New Testament, one of the Greek words for love. And it's talking about a unique kind of love, a kind of love that's seen most often in Christianity. In fact, the word is hardly found outside the New Testament, but it's all through the New Testament. Because agape is especially descriptive about that selfless kind of love, that love which puts the interests of someone else above your own interests. It's that deliberate type of goodwill expressed towards someone else. It's the love that Jesus came to show us when he came into this earth. And as we have an opportunity to meet together this day, as we're approaching that Christmas morning celebration of Christ's birth, I want you to see Jesus coming to bring his light to pierce the darkness of this world. I'd like for you to see Jesus as one who comes to take the darkness away from our lives. The first portion of our text, we don't usually have more than one, but the first portion of our text we're going to read right now is John chapter 1, verses 9 through 13, where we find these words. There was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, or the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. It says, he came to be the light, to take away our darkness. When we think about Christmas as Christ coming, he came for the purpose of dispelling darkness. We realize with the entrance of sin in this world, we were engulfed in darkness. Sin was a rejection of God in our lives. That's basically what sin is all about. That is why sin is so awful. That's why God's people should dread it, because sin is a denial of God. It is a rejection of God in our lives. God's nature is righteous, altogether pure. God is without flaw. There is no taint of sin in him. It is against his nature. It is anathema to his person. Sin stands in dark contrast with the very person of God. We were created in his image. We were created to be like him. From the way that God formed us at the beginning of human history, God made us to resemble himself. He made us to share his likeness, that we might share in his fellowship. That means that we were made from the very beginning to model his sinlessness. Isn't that amazing? We were made to be sinless. We were made to be like him. But you might say, we were set up for failure. If God designed us, expecting us to be sinless, well, that's an impossible task. Why would God put that upon us? Was he just setting us up that he might knock us down? Was he setting us up from the very beginning to fail? None of us can be sinless. So does God ask the impossible from us? No. No, God does not set us up for failure. God does not force us to do what is wrong, and he doesn't do that directly or indirectly. He doesn't put us in circumstances that would force us to do what is wrong. Notice that when God first created man, there was only one thing that man could do, which was counted as sin. God didn't set man up for failure. He made it so that it was very easy for man to remain sinless. All he had to do was avoid one thing, and that was to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. All he had to do was abstain from that fruit to remain sinless, to remain in fellowship with God. One no, and he could do anything else. How is it that there was only one thing wrong at the beginning, and now there are millions of things wrong? How is it that at the beginning there was only one thing that we could not do, and now today we find thousands and hundreds of thousands of things that we can do or say or even think, which are sin? How did our path to remain sinless become so cluttered? Because of the one thing that God had told man that he could not do. He could not eat of the tree which gave knowledge of good and evil. As long as he didn't do that, nothing else was sin. because nothing else he did had evil intent. Everything that was given for man to do, he did in innocence. His little baby lying in his crib. You give them a toy. He gets it in his tight grasp. And as you're leaning over the crib, he has one of those sort of jerky motions with the toy in his hand, and he bops you on the head with that toy. Has he done anything evil? Of course not. There was no intent. That baby is perfectly innocent. There was no intent to do what was wrong. Now you go a few years, and that child is 5 years old, and he gets that wicked glint in his eye just before he takes the toy in his hand and bops his brother over the head with it. And suddenly, there's consequences. You, mister, are going to sit in timeout until I say you can get up. Why is that? Because it was wrong, because he knew it was wrong before he did it. There was no innocence attached. When the baby had done it, he was innocent of any wrongdoing because there was no evil intent. You see why in the garden man could be perfect as long as he abstained from that one thing? He had no knowledge of good or evil. Everything he did in innocence. There was nothing sinful for him to do except eat from the one tree that he was told he could not partake of. And after he did that, we had a conscience, faulty conscience sometimes, but we had the knowledge of things that are wrong. And when we do them, we violated our conscience, we violated what is right, we have violated God by doing it. Now, sometimes I understand the line gets murky. We're living in a world of sin. We're living with darkness all around us, and it gets hard sometimes for us to determine what is actually wrong because we're so immersed in darkness that everything looks like, this is normal. This is what people do, you know. People get drunk on the weekends. People lie to their friends. People cheat on their wives. People, we could go on and list all the sins that man can do and say, well, this is part of our condition. This is just who I am. This is normal. But we know in our heart that that is not true. We have partaken of the tree. We know what's right and wrong. And when we do what is wrong, we have violated our relationship with God. We've caused darkness to come into this world. Man sinned and darkness fell. The rejection of God fills our life with misery. It had to. Because to become estranged to God takes us to a very dark place. God is our source of light. God is our source of life. God is our source of love. Every good thing in our life comes from Him. So what happens when we've made ourselves enemies of God? When we've walked away from a relationship with God? The only thing outside of God is misery. What's the one place in all that exists where God is not present? That place is called hell. And it is a place of torment because there is no portion of God in that place. Here we live in a broken world. A world tainted by sin. Still, it's a world that He created in the first place. And thus, there are fragments of good. There's fragments of beauty all around us. But it's a broken world because we broke it. And therefore, sin reigns. Every hurtful thing, every aching lack that we can experience, every corrupt and defiling thing was unleashed with our sin. The sin man wallows in makes him miserable, though he doesn't see it because darkness is everywhere. He can't perceive the fact that his misery is coming because he's forced God away. There is a great need all around us. There are people who are in different degrees of suffering all around us. Some are in tremendous lack. Some people are in agony because of their condition, whether it's physical or spiritual or mental. All around us we see what it means to live in a dark world because there's people who are suffering everywhere around us. But we can do very little to relieve it in others when we are ourselves consumed by that same darkness. With the entrance of Jesus in the world, when Jesus came into this world, darkness's tyranny was over. He brought light. He brought truth to dispel sin's lies. He brought hope to answer our hopelessness. He brought peace to answer the conflict which is tearing us apart inside. He brought love to answer sin's hate and apathy. In every way, Jesus cast his light into this dark world. And we can observe it in the way that he lived his life in this world. Look at the light and the warmth from that light that Jesus was bringing into the world. He shows it in his walk by the compassion that he shows to the outcast. The lepers, we see lepers and Jesus interacting from time to time in the New Testament. Think of that. The lepers were those who were separated from society. They couldn't have any contact with family. They couldn't have any contact with friends. They had to stay away from society in general. If somebody came near them, they had to shout out, "Unclean, unclean, stay away from me." And because of that, they had no one in this world for companionship. But when Jesus walked this earth, he spoke to them, he touched them, he healed them, because his life was overflowing with compassion to these who were estranged. When Jesus walked this earth, there were children who were thought to be too immature and unimportant to bother anybody that was important. Keep that rabble, keep those children away from me. That's the way important people acted. When his disciples tried to separate the children from Jesus, what did he say? "Let the little children come to me." He had time for the immature and those that people thought were not important. When Jesus walked this earth, he addressed every form of physical deformity, blindness, deafness. He addressed issues of blood. He addressed lameness. He addressed just about anything that could happen to a person. Jesus was healing the many people that were physically deformed and in pain and distress because of their physical problems. Jesus, when he walked this earth, elevated the worth of the common man. He ate with sinners. He took interest in people that were too low on the social ladder to do him any good. That was a common criticism of Jesus, that he was eating with the poor and the sinful people, that he was spending time among people who didn't matter in the eyes of others. But Jesus saw the worth of the common man and went to them. Jesus, when he walked this earth, showed the way to come back to God for all of us who are estranged by our sin. And even dying, that man's rescue from darkness might be made complete. Dark is cold. Light brings warmth. Jesus cared enough to bring us the warmth from God that makes life worth living. And that tiny baby that was born long ago was the hope of all mankind, because he was bringing light which would allow each person to emerge from that coldness and oppression of darkness. Now we come to the second portion of our text, which reveals what his coming as light should mean in the lives of those who belong to him. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, and then we're going to read from verses 8 through 10. Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love, just as Christ also loved you and gave himself up for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. Now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth, trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. Jesus came as the light to dispel the darkness, and those of us who are his become lights. Do you see that in the passage we just read? Now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. The very purpose for which Jesus came to this world becomes our purpose when we have a relationship with him. In the first creation, we were made to be like him. We were made in his image. That likeness was destroyed by sin. But in his new creation, as we become new creatures accepting his work for us, we again become like him. And as he was light, we become light. We again share his nature, and that's what we should be doing as his people, shining forth in the darkness. We are blessed to be a blessing. We are enlightened that we might share his truth. We are warmed that we might share his warmth. And so his followers are supposed to be able to be identified by love. Well, no, we are Christians by our love. We're to walk in love and live as an expression of love in this dark world. We care and we share. We do the sometimes messy, sometimes costly work of loving others. And again, this is who we are in him. It can be seen as a mark of those who have given their lives to him, that they act as those shedding his light in this present world. And thus Jesus can express it in the scene of judgment that he taught. He says to those who are his, you fed the hungry, you gave the thirsty to drink, you welcomed the stranger, you visited those in prisoners, you clothed those lacking in clothes, so on and so forth. And in each case, we were told we were doing it unto him. We were doing it for him. We were ministering to other people in their need for his sake. You can't separate light from being light from receiving his light. You can't separate being an expression of him from having him in our lives. The only way we remain in the light is as we shine it from our lives. That light cannot last in our lives if we are not shining out into the lives of others. We are enriched by blessing others. In Crown Heights, there was a Jew by the name of Yankel who owned a bakery. He had survived the Nazi concentration camps in World War II. He once said, you know why it is that I'm alive today? I was a kid, just a teenager at the time. We were on the train in a boxcar being taken to Auschwitz. Night came and it was freezing, deathly cold in that boxcar. The Germans would leave the cars on the side of the tracks overnight, sometimes for days on end, without any food and, of course, no blankets to keep us warm, he said. Sitting next to me was an older Jew, this beloved elderly Jew from my hometown I recognized, but I had never seen him like this. He was shivering from head to toe. He looked terrible. And so I wrapped my arms around him and began rubbing him to warm him up. I rubbed his arms, his legs, his face, his neck. I begged him to hang on. All night long I kept the man warm that way. I was tired. I was freezing cold myself. My fingers were numb, but I didn't stop rubbing the heat on this man's body. Hours and hours went by this way. And finally night passed, morning came, and the sun began to shine. There was some warmth in the cabin. And then I looked around the car to see of the other Jews in the car. To my horror, all I could see was frozen bodies. And all I could hear was a deathly silence. Nobody else in that cabin made it through the night. They all died from the frost. Only 2 people survived, the old man and me. The old man survived because somebody kept him warm. I survived because I was warming somebody else. When you warm other people's lives, you remain warm yourself. When you share his light remains in you. When you seek to support, encourage, inspire others, you discover support, encouragement, and inspiration in your own life as well. That brings us to our conclusion this morning. See the light, be a light. Let his love shine from your life. If you'd like to experience Jesus lighting up the darkness in your life, if you'd like to come to him for the first time, we have an invitation for that. If you'd like to renew your commitment to be a life for him, we want you to have an opportunity to make your commitment to that as well. This morning, as we have our invitation, if you have a decision to make, we invite you to come forward. Won't you do so as we stand and sing our invitation song?